Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The Christmas season is upon us, and that puts me in mind of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Published in 1844, this classic work of literature is still timely today, and with me to discuss the timeliness of A Christmas Carol are David Nickell, sociology professor on campus, and Legatha Spelbring, English professor on campus. Welcome to the program.
Thank
And
you.
you have a nice Christmassy shirt on, I see
I
there.
came prepared.
Let's begin with a little background of who was Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens was born right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, Victorian era. His father was a clerk, much like Mr. Cratchit in the story. Grew up in really kind of a well-to-do family there for a while, but then he fell on hard times. So, and then his writings really reflect the poor and downtrodden during that time period.
Mm-hmm. And of course, his father is sent away to a debtor's prison,
Yes.
which thankfully we don't have those today because most Americans would be behind bars. And poor
true.
young Charles winds up working in a factory where he
factory.
pastes labels on boot polish
At 12 years old.
at 12
of
years
age.
old. And that
Yeah.
really affects his life.
Yeah.
You know the story very well. We all know the story. What implications does this story have for us today?
It's very much reflective of what is going on with globalization in the world today, because what was happening at the time this was being written was the Industrial Revolution, which comes after Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. Free market capitalism is adopted as a model. That was published in 1776. England was the first nation to adopt that as a policy, and it leads to industrialization. Part of what has to happen for that to take place is the commodification of land, so that land becomes treated as property, which means villagers can't do subsistence farming on it as a commons anymore. It's now owned by the landed gentry, the wealthier people, who will do with it whatever will make the most profit. And it's not very profitable to let peasants do subsistence farming on it. So the peasants are kicked off of it. The only place they can go is into the cities, where they become this massive pool of very cheap labor, just as the factory system is getting going. And that's what makes the Industrial Revolution run. And so what Charles Dickens is describing there is a two-class system. Very small, extremely wealthy class, the bourgeoisie, which is generating higher levels of profits than the kings under the old feudal system had ever seen. This is the time period when we get the old money families, the empires that we still talk of as the old money today, put in place. The masses of people, the proletariat, were living in abject squalor. So in one of Dickens's other works, The Tale of Two Cities, it's really one city, right? London, but it's like two different realities, is what he's referring to. You've got the very wealthy people and the way they live, and then right in their midst, the common people and the way they're living. There was no middle class. And what we have going today with globalization under the auspices of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, is setting up treaties and programs where, in order to give these developing countries loans to develop, you have to institute modern economic systems, modern economic reforms. One of the most controversial parts of that is land reform, it's called, which means you turn the land into a commodity, kick the peasants off of it that have been doing subsistence farming. The only place they can go is into the cities. So 11 of the 20 largest cities in the world now are in developing countries that 15, 20 years ago were predominantly agricultural. The cities are growing because the people are coming out of the countryside, where they become this very large pool of very cheap labor because they've got no other commodity no other way to feed themselves except to sell their own labor as a commodity. That's what attracts industry, factories to those places to take advantage of the cheap labor. And that's what's driving the globalization of our economy today. So in those places, there still is no middle class. Middle class comes about through labor unions and things later on. You still have this two-class system in place. So, like we were talking about before, right now in Brazil is one of the leading exporters of food in this hemisphere. Is the second largest market in the world for private jets, and has over 60% of the population below absolute standard of poverty. It's a two-class system and nobody in the middle.
Going back to the book, for those who don't know this book, if there are people who don't know this book, just trace the plot line, if you would, please, for us.
Okay. It starts with, we all know Ebenezer Scrooge.
And what a name. You know, Dickens always had interesting names. Scrooge.
Scrooge. I mean, it sounds like
It sounds like what he is.
You know, what he really was.
And even today, we consider, well, he's an old Scrooge. He's
That's
a
right.
skinflint or a tight
And
one.
his business was an accounting business. So, you know, and it starts out with these two gentlemen coming in and wanting him to make a charitable donation. And we get his attitude right off the bat. He's not going to do it. And then his nephew comes in and wishes him a Merry Christmas, and of course we get the bah humbug right off the bat. So we really have this terrible man, uncharitable man who's not going to help anyone, who then gets the visit from his old partner who was just like him, who tells him he's going to have to change his ways. And in order to convince him, he has Christmas past, present, and yet to come visit him and show him, you know, what it was like in his childhood, which was nice. You know, he wasn't always Scrooge. And then we see the present, where the Cratchits are having a very difficult time, a man who works for him and the family and what that entails. And then we have our visit from Christmas Yet to Come, which gets into the part of where they're discussing this terrible man's death, and he can't figure out who it is, and it turns out to be him. And so how he can reform and to become a giving person and change what's going to really happen to him. You know, because if he doesn't, he's going to end up this terrible situation. And I think it's really telling with the Christmas Present becomes older as he's going along with him. And toward the end of his presence, he opens up his coat, and there are these two starving children underneath. Because we see Dickens as always a champion of children, you know, the poor. And so, you know, he has that two-class system obviously in there, but he's also showing that, you know, we're a brotherhood of people, and it's our responsibility to help those who do not have it.
And I guess, David, the idea of the Cratchits, they're sort of the invisible poor. Right. I know nothing of these people and care nothing about these people.
And yet, you're completely dependent on them because they're the ones that are actually doing the work and producing the wealth.
Right.
But they're invisible to you, so you get this very large class of people who are getting much and doing little, and a very large class of people that are doing all the work but are not getting anything from it. And the child labor is especially significant when you look at globalization and what's happening in these developing countries today, because that was before child labor laws. There were no minimum wages, no safety regulations, no environmental requirements of any kind, no 40-hour work weeks, nothing that we take for granted today in the developed world, and don't realize that largely came about due to labor movements later on, and that has not happened. And as a matter of fact, it's questionable whether or not that even can happen in a globalized economy now. Part of what's going on in Mexico is the workers there tried to organize into unions, and the factories just pulled out and went to Indonesia or Korea or India or someplace else where the workers would not organize and would work cheaper, and just left them with nothing.
Was Dickens at heart an optimist? I mean, you look at this, and even this hard-hearted scoundrel, old Scrooge, and in the end, not to give away the end of the book, but he has a change of heart, to say the least.
I think he is an optimist because he believes that you can change, that people can change, and they will come around and to do the right thing. You know, but many of his books speak toward that, oh, woe is me type thing. So, but when we look at him, we realize that he experienced both sides of the coin. So I think that gave him a great perspective to be able to write about what these children and what people, the poor, go through, because he had it pretty well. Then he was relegated to that. So he saw both sides of it. But I do believe that he felt that people could change, and there was that optimism there.
What was the background of him writing this? What moved him to write this particular?
You know, I really don't know what, other than what he had lived himself, you know.
And of course, Christmas was a big holiday for the Victorians, that period.
Exactly. You know, children, that would make such, we can only imagine as he was going through the turmoils that he went through as a child and being separated from his family, what it would have been like at Christmas time not to have been able to celebrate it the way they had originally been able to do it. That had to be a traumatic experience for him to go through on all levels.
And of course, there's Tiny Tim, who's the lovable little kid who's disabled. Would he possibly have been Dickens himself? Would Dickens have written himself into that character?
I think in many ways Dickens is reflective in a lot of his characters. I think or perhaps Tiny Tim is a reflection of who he wants us to be. Because if anyone in that novel has a reason or an excuse not to be kind, not to be good, not to be optimistic, you would think it would be Tiny Tim. I mean, he has the physical problem going along as well as the poverty that he sees and experiences with his family. Yet he's one of the most optimistic characters
ever cheerful.
In that. Yes, ever cheerful.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think there's a bit of Dickens obviously there.
Yeah. And the character Bob Cratchit. Bob is the overworked, underpaid everyman, I guess.
I think so, and not complaining. He doesn't complain. He does what you're supposed to do. You know, he's taking care of his family as best he can. He doesn't even want anyone to make disparaging remarks about Ebenezer Scrooge. You know, his family would say something, and he would kind of stand up for him a little bit. You know, but I think he's the everyman. Yeah,
he is very much accepting it. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is like the natural order of things, and it's interesting because that time period was a major transition in society in the way it functioned as a whole, because you go from the masses of people living out, you know, being self-reliant and self-sufficient farmers and things to being, or at least subsistence farmers, to being crowded in these urban areas that prior to this there were real limitations on how many people could live in a city because you couldn't feed them. You couldn't transport food in from very far, and there was a limit on how much food you could grow from that distance. There was no good way to preserve it. Elements of the Enlightenment were just starting to kick in. So you get a little bit of science there, a little bit of agricultural technology. You're increasing the amount of food you can raise per acre, ability to transport it with industrialization going on. So you're seemingly removing the limits on the number of people can live in a city, just as everybody's having to come to the cities. And you're getting social problems happening there that nobody had ever seen before, like massive numbers of these homeless orphans, massive numbers of unwed mothers, disease, crime, and things that nobody had ever known before. But the masses of people just went along with it and accepted this is just the way it's supposed to be. And of course that was encouraged by the people
Right.
at the top that owned the factories and things. But
Well, even in some cases from the pulpit,
right,
that God
absolutely.
intended
Oh,
some people to
absolutely.
be great and some people to be not so great. And if you challenge that, you were challenging God's plan. And that's a powerful message.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, there's also, and the book that really made all that possible was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Outlines principles of the free market system. And everybody forgets he also wrote a companion book to that called On Moral Sentiment, in which he argued that every human being has the capacity and even the inclination to feel concern for the people around you. For your neighbors, for your friends. And I think that's the kind of thing Dickens
I
is
think so.
talking about here. That capacity is there if you can just tap into it. And Adam Smith, in answering objections to this theory of capitalism, said that will always work as a moral temperament to the harsh edges of capitalism. It'll keep it under control, and people won't do things that are very harmful to their neighbors and their communities because you will feel concerning. Which, one of the questions today is, when you're dealing with multinational corporations, they're moving corporations from one developing country to another. However much that potential might have been there in Dickens's day, it just does not seem to be there today. There's not any loyalty to individual nation, much less, not from the corporations.
Another thing, too, people associate ghosts with Halloween, but Christmas was a traditional ghost time, too, so he throws a ghost, the ghosts in there.
Yeah.
Describe the ghosts, and maybe with an idea of how he might have come up with these characters.
Well, the Ghost of Christmas Past, I think he was displayed as a more jovial type with his robes and things like that.
Almost Santa Claus-like.
Almost Santa Claus-like, exactly. Then the Ghost of Present, we see him, as I stated earlier, as they go along, he starts getting older as he goes. And then that segues into the hooded, dark Ghost of Christmas of time yet to come, which is more like the Death, Grim Reaper type style. That would depict, I think, this is what is going to happen if you don't change. The moral of this story is you better change
or else.
And so I think they're very reflective of their each of their sections.
And I think it really becomes believable because it's a dream. People have strange dreams all the time. And
That's right.
I guess one of the things I suppose is a measure of the enduring nature of literature is that it gets spun off in different directions. There's the Bill Murray comedy called Scrooged, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's the same thing. And I know there have been certainly more than one movie version of this and film version of this. And it's really a timeless story.
Absolutely. It's a sign of really good literature because it's going to be around and it's going to morph and adapt as we go along.
And lots of times in literature too, you see stories told through dreams, which I think is kind of interesting. I suppose because you're sort of in a dream. It's what uncontrolled thoughts, and you go from there. You were about to say something.
No.
You were not about to say something. I'm sorry, I misinterpreted your gesture. Dickens himself would read this. He was famous for readings, was he not? And public readings. And wouldn't that have been fun to have heard him do that? I know he did other. In fact, we were talking earlier when Dickens wrote American Notes when he traveled through the United States, and he came through our part of the country, and I must say he was singularly unimpressed. He wrote some pretty bad stuff about us, and then he came down the Ohio River, and of course there was a legend that he stopped at the Gower House, which if he did, he left no record of it, the Gower House in Smithland, and then he allegedly gave it a talk in Paducah, and again, if he did, there was no record of it, but he cut quite a broad swath. Very popular in this thing, I'm assuming, became a bestseller pretty quickly, very well received.
I would think so, because I think the common man really equates to what he writes. You know, it really speaks to the common man. We all understand what it's like to have to make it paycheck to paycheck, or when you lose that job, you know, what happens and how quickly circumstances change. And we certainly see that today. I mean, it's a timeless situation that doesn't, it's not going to change. That's part of humanity. That's part
Do you
of
suppose
life.
if Dickens hadn't wound up working in the bootblack factory, he would have written this?
Oh, that's a really good question.
I would think probably not.
I think I agree with you, because I think that made that was such a traumatic impression on him as a child.
And I would think too that had he not come from the upper class, had lived his entire life in the lower working class, he probably would not have been able to write it either.
That's right. I agree.
It probably took being able to see both sides of it.
And again, even though while this work is talked about at Christmas, it's timely year-round. Do they teach it in English lit classes as Christmas Carol? If you took a course on Dickens, would they do the Christmas Carol?
It seems to me that we're getting long, you know, that we could really get on this thing. We're getting more away from the timeless classics, which is really a shame. I hate to say that. I would think that taking that particular really focused literature course of Charles Dickens, surely to goodness, this one would be
Now,
right
it's
there
a
on
fairly
top.
short work, isn't it? It's not.
Yeah, it's not really.
And
really terribly
he was
long.
famous for tomes. I remember Bleak House when I was in senior English in high school, and it was pretty bleak.
Bleak, yes.
It is, and I guess, but another thing too about this Dickens style. Literature today is much less descriptive, is it not? Dickens was a tremendous, he could paint a picture in words.
Yes, you still, obviously there are writers who do that, but we don't seem to see as much of the description, I think, as we would get from someone like Dickens. Just, you're right, you can just visualize it in your mind as you walk down those streets of London, and that, and he really, you'll see the fog and the smoke and the soot and all of that.
And of
in
course,
his writing.
I was going to say, I think part of it is we don't have the patience anymore to sit and wait for that long of a description to come to us.
that's an interesting point. Yeah,
We're used to different media.
right.
Yeah, that's a heartbreaker for a litture teacher.
It is,
I'll tell you.
and also people, and I try to convince students this is actually possible, that you can read for pleasure. You don't have to read because
That's
you
true.
have an assignment.
That's right.
That you could read for pleasure. And in the 19th century, people would literally curl up with a good book and would read this.
That's right.
But again, you know, many years ago, I went to a lecture at Murray State in which Clint Brooks, the great critic, came. And he said that if you're a writer, write about what you know. If you've never been to New York City, don't write a novel about New York City. If you've never lived on a farm in Livingston County, don't write about a farm in Livingston County because you
That's
can't
right.
get it. And so Dickens knew London intimately. And I suspect you could probably go and walk these streets and find where these places were that he wrote about.
Yeah. And also the descriptions he gives, not just in the Christmas Carol, but some of the others are the detail about what daily life was like in a big city during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution.
It's a real indictment.
Yes, it was not a good time for everyday people. It made vast fortunes for a few, but it was not a good time for
We
the
talked about
majority of
this
people.
earlier. Dickens often has disabled people in his works. Tiny Tim is polio, who knows, it was a crippling ailment. And there are a lot of amputees. Is that sort of a metaphor for a society that's disabled, do you suppose?
It's a possibility that it is. Of course, and as you'd mentioned earlier when we'd talked, that they had a lot of the war.
Oh, right. Yeah, the Napoleonic Wars. There were a lot. He knew a lot of. He saw a
So-
lot of it. I
so
mean, you
you
would
would have
see
seen
that.
a lot of
and that
that.
was part of poverty because at that
Yes.
time soldiers were not pensioned. They didn't have disability
That's right.
pensions and places to go. And that was part of. And you think there too, if you're a working class person, you're you have to be strong of limb. And so this fellow loses an arm, leg, or both. Your life is...
That's right.
So
You're
like-
even worse off than before.
And if Tiny Tim is the object of hope, and he's so crippled, there's not much glimmer of hope there, and yet it still comes through for him.
That's
Oh,
a
that's
very
perfect.
good point.
Very
yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's the other thing too.
That makes sense.
That it would seem to me, and I guess I'm hopelessly naive, in a lit class where you read something and analyze it, that it's not just a story, and it is a wonderful story. And I think another thing about A Christmas Carol, it can be read on two levels. It can be read as an adult, a very sophisticated level, but yet it's a terrific story for a kid to
That's
read.
right.
A 10-year-old could read this and love it. And to me, that's what makes it so timeless. It's a neat story, but yet it has great social ramifications as well. We're about out of time, by the way. And any final thoughts? It always goes fast.
Well, I think, you talked about the fact that it is timeless. And I think with the situation that our economy and everything, what we're all facing now, and that instability, that insecurity that Dickens felt as that 12-year-old when he went to work in that factory. But to still be able to have that optimistic view and to stress the fact that we are a brotherhood and we are going to have to take care of one another. We need to have that in our character. I think that's what the story is about, that we need to remember that, and not, like you said, not just at Christmas time. We need to remember that year-round, and I think that's what we can take away from the Christmas Carol.
Any final thoughts?
My final thought on this, I guess, would be that what Dickens is describing there is, we thought for a long time maybe we'd move beyond with middle classes and things, and if you look with globalization now, that's what's going on in a lot of the world. And I think everybody ought to be aware of that at Christmas time as well. The cheap Christmas presents you're going for were made by Tiny Tim out there in the factory.
That's a very good point.
That is very good.
Very good point. We'll have to end it with that. We're out of time. Always run out of time on these shows. My guest today was David Nickell and Legatha Spelbring. I'm Barry Craig, and have a happy holiday season.